There is a quiet war happening inside every human being, not between good and evil, but between what keeps you comfortable and what forces you to become real. And most people never notice when they lose it. They don't fall in one moment. They disappear slowly through habits that feel harmless but quietly erase their spirit while their flesh keeps moving. Emotional numbness does not begin as a problem. It begins as a solution. At first, it appears as strength, the ability to handle things, to stay composed when others break, to remain functional when life becomes heavy. A person slowly learns that feeling deeply is expensive. It costs energy, attention, vulnerability, and sometimes even relationships. So the mind makes a quiet decision to reduce the intensity of experience, not to stop feeling completely, but to feel less. And in the beginning, this feels like control. It feels like maturity. It feels like survival in a world that often rewards those who do not show too much emotion. But what starts as control gradually becomes distance. The same mechanism that protects a person from overwhelming pain also begins to filter out joy, excitement, and connection. The emotional spectrum becomes narrower. Moments that once would have moved the heart now pass without impact. A sunset becomes just a change in lighting. A conversation becomes just exchange of words. Even relationships begin to feel like responsibilities rather than living experiences. The inner world becomes quieter, not because it is peaceful, but because it is muted. The most deceptive part of emotional numbness is that life still functions on the surface. The body continues to wake up, to eat, to work, to respond. From the outside, everything appears normal. People may even describe such a person as stable, strong, or reliable. But inside, something essential begins to fade. The capacity to be touched by life diminishes. And when a person is no longer touched by life, they are no longer fully participating in it. They are observing it from a distance, as if standing behind glass while everything meaningful happens on the other side. This distance is not always noticed immediately. It builds slowly through repeated experiences where feeling was either punished, ignored, or too painful to hold. A person learns that expressing emotion does not always lead to understanding. Sometimes it leads to rejection. Sometimes it leads to conflict. Sometimes it leads to being misunderstood. So the safest response becomes silence. And silence, repeated enough times, becomes emotional withdrawal. The heart begins to close, not out of choice, but out of habit. Over time, even internal reactions change. Where there was once sadness, there is now emptiness. Where there was once excitement, there is now indifference. Where there was once anger, there is now detachment. The absence of strong emotion is often mistaken for peace, but it is not peace. Peace is alive, present, aware. Emotional numbness is different. It is absence of depth. It is the quieting of the inner voice that once responded naturally to life. What makes this state even more complex is that it often feels easier than emotional engagement. Feeling deeply requires energy and openness. It requires the willingness to be affected, to be changed by what happens. Emotional numbness removes that requirement. It creates a predictable inner environment where nothing feels too intense, but also nothing feels truly alive. And in that predictability, a person may begin to believe they are stable, when in reality they are simply disconnected from the natural volatility that makes life meaningful. Relationships begin to reflect this internal condition. People who once felt close now feel distant, not necessarily physically, but emotionally. Conversations continue, interactions happen, but the sense of true presence fades. The ability to empathize weakens because empathy requires emotional access, and emotional access has been reduced. Even moments of care become mechanical rather than felt. The spirit in this condition does not disappear, it becomes inaccessible beneath layers of controlled response and emotional filtering. Constant distraction does not begin as a trap, it begins as comfort. In a world that often feels heavy, uncertain, and emotionally demanding, distraction offers immediate relief. It is always available, always accessible, and always ready to replace discomfort with stimulation. A person does not need to confront silence, memory, or inner questioning when there is always something to watch, scroll, listen to, or respond to. At first, this feels like freedom. The mind is entertained, the emotions are managed, and the difficult parts of awareness are postponed without effort. It feels harmless because it is socially accepted and technologically supported, but distraction slowly becomes a habit of escape. The mind learns that every moment of discomfort can be replaced instantly with something external. Waiting becomes intolerable. Stillness becomes uncomfortable. Even brief pauses begin to feel empty. And in that emptiness, instead of reflection, the instinct becomes avoidance. The phone is reached for without thought. Background noise is kept on at all times. Attention is constantly divided, never allowed to fully settle on a single thought long enough for it to deepen or reveal anything meaningful. Over time, this habit reshapes the structure of attention itself. The mind becomes trained to move quickly from one stimulus to another, never staying long enough to experience depth. Reading becomes difficult because sustained focus feels heavy. Conversations lose presence because attention keeps splitting between internal impulses and external signals. Even simple moments like sitting alone, walking without purpose, or waiting without input begin to feel unnatural. The absence of stimulation is no longer neutral. It is perceived as discomfort. This is where distraction begins to affect something deeper than attention. It begins to affect self-awareness because self-awareness requires uninterrupted presence. It requires the ability to sit with thoughts without immediately replacing them. It requires the courage to remain in silence long enough for internal truth to surface. But constant distraction interrupts this process repeatedly. Every moment that could lead to reflection is replaced by input. Every opportunity for inner dialogue is interrupted by external noise, and slowly a person becomes more familiar with the outside world than with their own inner landscape. The danger is not the presence of technology or information itself, but the absence of stillness. When silence disappears, introspection disappears with it. A mind that is never still cannot observe its own patterns clearly. It reacts, it consumes, it processes, but it does not understand itself. And without understanding, patterns repeat unconsciously. The same thoughts return in cycles. The same emotional responses appear in different situations. Yet there is no space to recognize them as patterns because attention is always moving forward, never turning inward. Constant distraction also weakens emotional endurance. Moments of discomfort, uncertainty, or boredom are no longer experienced fully. They are immediately avoided. But emotional growth requires the ability to stay present with discomfort long enough to learn from it. When this ability is lost, even small challenges feel overwhelming because there is no internal practice of sitting with difficulty. The instinct becomes escape rather than engagement, and escape, repeated over time, becomes identity. Even relationships are affected in subtle ways. Presence becomes fragmented. Conversations are interrupted not always physically, but mentally. A part of the mind is always elsewhere, waiting for the next signal, the next update, the next shift in attention. This divided presence reduces depth in human connection. People are heard, but not fully received. Moments are experienced, but not fully absorbed. And over time, connection becomes surface level even when interaction is frequent. What begins as a tool for comfort gradually becomes a structure of avoidance that reshapes perception itself, making silence feel unfamiliar, stillness feel uncomfortable, and inner awareness feel distant until the mind becomes more responsive to everything except its own unobserved self. Living for approval does not begin as a conscious betrayal of the self. It begins as a simple human need to be accepted, to be included, to be seen in a positive light. From early experiences, a person learns that certain behaviors bring appreciation, while others bring criticism or rejection. Slowly, attention shifts outward. Instead of asking what feels true internally, the mind begins to calculate what will be received well externally. This shift is subtle at first, almost invisible, because it is wrapped in social adaptation. It looks like politeness, responsibility, awareness, and emotional intelligence. But over time, this outward focus becomes a filter through which all decisions pass. Choices are no longer made from a place of inner alignment, but from an imagined audience that evaluates everything. Even in solitude, this imagined presence remains active. A person begins to rehearse conversations before they happen, adjust opinions before expressing them, and modify emotional responses depending on who is watching. The self becomes divided into what is felt internally and what is presented externally, and gradually the external version starts to dominate because it receives feedback while the internal version remains unseen. This creates a slow erosion of authenticity. The natural instinct to express something genuine becomes interrupted by a question that appears before every action. How will this be received? Over time, this question becomes automatic. It no longer feels like a choice, but like a reflex. Even simple preferences begin to lose clarity. A person may struggle to answer what they truly enjoy because enjoyment itself has been filtered through acceptance. What is liked is often what is approved of, and what is avoided is often what might cause disapproval. The emotional cost of this habit is rarely immediate, but it accumulates quietly. Every moment of self-suppression creates a small internal disconnection. Saying yes when the internal answer is no creates fragmentation. Staying silent when something needs expression creates internal tension. Smiling when there is discomfort creates emotional contradiction. None of these moments seem significant individually, but together they form a pattern where the internal voice becomes less trusted and less heard. As this pattern deepens, identity begins to shift. Instead of being anchored in inner certainty, identity becomes shaped by external reactions. Compliments create temporary confidence. Criticism creates confusion. Approval creates direction. Disapproval creates self-doubt. In this state, stability depends on response from others rather than internal grounding. The self becomes reactive rather than rooted, constantly adjusting based on the emotional feedback of the environment. Relationships also become complicated under the weight of approval seeking. Instead of being spaces of mutual truth, they become stages of performance. Words are chosen carefully to maintain harmony. Opinions are softened to avoid conflict. Emotions are managed to preserve acceptance. Even disagreement becomes uncomfortable because it risks disrupting the fragile sense of belonging. As a result, true intimacy becomes difficult because intimacy requires honesty, and honesty requires the willingness to risk disapproval. There is also a quiet exhaustion that develops from constantly managing perception. Maintaining an acceptable version of oneself requires continuous monitoring. Every interaction becomes a calculation. Every expression becomes a decision. This ongoing internal management consumes emotional energy that could otherwise be used for creativity, presence, or reflection. Life begins to feel like an ongoing presentation rather than an experience. Eventually, a person may begin to lose clarity about where they end and where expectation begins. The voice of approval becomes so integrated that it feels like personal thought. Desires become uncertain because they are constantly adjusted. Decisions become hesitant because they depend on imagined reactions. Even silence becomes filled with internal questioning about how it is perceived. The original self does not disappear, but it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish from the layers of adaptation built over time. Avoiding inner pain does not begin as weakness. It begins as intelligence, as self-protection, as a natural response to emotional overload. When a person first encounters experiences that feel too intense to process, loss, rejection, betrayal, disappointment, the nervous system learns quickly that certain feelings are too heavy to fully enter. So instead of processing them, the mind begins to build pathways around them. Distraction, rationalization, denial, overthinking, and emotional detachment all become tools that help a person move away from what hurts too much to face directly. At first, this seems like healing because life continues, responsibilities are met, and outward functionality is preserved. But what is not processed does not disappear. It remains stored in the body, in memory, in reactions, and in subtle emotional patterns that surface later in unexpected ways. Avoidance creates an invisible accumulation of unprocessed experience. A person may believe they have moved on because time has passed, but time alone does not integrate emotional experience. Only presence does. And when presence is consistently avoided in moments of pain, the pain does not resolve, it fragments. It returns not as a single experience, but as scattered emotional responses triggered by unrelated situations. Over time, this habit begins to shape personality. A person who avoids inner pain becomes skilled at escaping discomfort in all its forms. Difficult conversations are postponed. Emotional vulnerability is reduced. Situations that could lead to deep reflection are subtly avoided. Even within relationships, there is a tendency to maintain distance from anything that might activate unresolved emotional layers. This is not always visible from the outside because the person may appear composed, capable, and even emotionally stable, but internally there is a growing limitation in how much emotional depth can be accessed without triggering avoidance mechanisms. The cost of this pattern is not immediate collapse, but gradual restriction. Life becomes narrower not in external experience, but in internal capacity. Joy becomes less intense because depth has been reduced. Sadness becomes harder to process because it is not fully allowed. Even moments of love or connection carry a subtle boundary, as if the emotional system has learned to stay partially closed at all times. The result is a life that is lived safely, but not fully. Avoidance also distorts perception of strength. Many people begin to associate strength with the ability to not feel, to not break, to not show vulnerability. But in reality, this is not strength. It is containment. True emotional strength requires the ability to stay present with what is uncomfortable without immediately escaping it. When avoidance becomes the dominant strategy, emotional resilience does not grow. It stagnates. The capacity to process complex emotional states becomes weaker over time, making even small emotional challenges feel disproportionately heavy. In relationships, this habit creates invisible distance. When one person consistently avoids inner pain, they also avoid emotional transparency. Difficult emotions are softened, hidden, or redirected. Conversations stay at surface level because deeper emotional truth feels unsafe to access. Over time, connection loses its depth not because of lack of care, but because of lack of emotional accessibility. The relationship continues in form, but emotional intimacy becomes limited by the boundaries created through avoidance. There is also a subtle internal confusion that develops. A person may begin to lose clarity about what they actually feel because emotions were never fully experienced in their raw form. Instead of being felt, they were managed, redirected, or suppressed. This creates a gap between experience and understanding. Emotional responses appear without full awareness of their origin, and reactions may feel disconnected from present reality because they are shaped by unresolved past material that was never fully processed. Eventually, avoidance becomes automatic. the mind reacts to discomfort before conscious awareness can intervene. The body tightens, the thoughts shift, attention moves elsewhere, and the opportunity for emotional integration passes once again, leaving the deeper layers of experience waiting beneath the surface, shaping perception, influencing reactions, quietly accumulating without resolution. Delaying life does not begin as avoidance, it begins as reasoning. A person tells themselves they are being practical, responsible, and thoughtful about timing. There is always a justification that sounds logical in the moment. The conditions are not right yet. The circumstances are not stable enough. There is still preparation needed, more learning required, more confidence to be built before taking the next step. This creates the illusion that life is being managed wisely rather than postponed because the mind prefers explanations that reduce discomfort. In this way, delay becomes disguised as planning, and hesitation becomes disguised as caution. But underneath this reasoning, something more subtle begins to form, a quiet separation between intention and action. A person may genuinely want change, growth, or transformation, but the movement toward it is continuously postponed into an undefined future. That future always appears close enough to feel possible, yet far enough to never fully arrive. It becomes a psychological space where decisions are safely imagined but never embodied. In this space, desire remains alive, but execution remains absent, and over time, the gap between the two becomes normalized. What makes this habit powerful is that it rarely feels like refusal. It feels like waiting. And waiting does not carry the emotional weight of loss in the same immediate way as giving up. So the mind remains comfortable in the idea that nothing is being abandoned, only postponed. But life does not experience intention in isolation. It only responds to movement. And when movement does not occur, even the strongest intentions begin to lose emotional charge. What was once urgent becomes familiar. What was once inspiring becomes background thought. The emotional energy that could have been directed into action slowly disperses into repetition of planning without execution. As this pattern continues, a subtle shift occurs in identity. A person begins to see themselves as someone who is about to change rather than someone who is changing. The self becomes located in potential rather than presence. This creates a psychological identity built around future versions of the self, while the present version remains underdeveloped. Over time, this leads to a quiet internal contradiction. There is awareness of what could be done, but there is also repeated inaction. And this combination creates tension that is often explained away through external circumstances rather than internal resistance. The emotional impact of delay is not always immediate frustration. Often it is a gradual erosion of trust in one's own timing. Each postponed action slightly weakens the relationship between intention and execution. A person begins to unconsciously doubt whether they will actually follow through even when motivation is strong. This doubt does not always appear as conscious thought, but it influences behavior subtly, making initiation more difficult each time. The threshold for starting grows higher, while the habit of postponement grows easier. Relationships with personal goals also become complex. Goals begin to accumulate in the mind without corresponding movement in reality. They exist as plans, ideas, and future possibilities, but not as lived experiences. This accumulation creates mental clutter, where unfinished intentions coexist with new ones, and the weight of what has not been started begins to influence emotional state. There is often a quiet awareness that time is passing while change remains theoretical, but this awareness alone is not enough to disrupt the cycle because it is repeatedly overridden by the comfort of postponement. Even emotional energy becomes affected by this pattern. The excitement that initially accompanies new intentions begins to weaken when it is not translated into action. Motivation becomes cyclical, appearing strongly at moments of inspiration and fading during execution phases that never fully begin. This creates a pattern where enthusiasm is experienced repeatedly, but never sustained long enough to produce transformation. The result is a life filled with repeated beginnings that never fully develop into continuation. Eventually, delaying life becomes less of a conscious decision and more of an automatic response. The mind learns to associate change with future conditions rather than present action. The present moment becomes a holding space rather than a place of movement, and in this space, life is continuously prepared for but rarely entered fully, leaving potential suspended in a constant state of almost becoming. Forgetting yourself does not begin as disappearance, it begins as adaptation. A person slowly learns to survive by becoming many versions of themselves for different environments. One version for work, one version for family, one version for relationships, one version for expectations, one version for social situations. At first, this ability to adapt feels like maturity. It feels like intelligence to know how to behave differently depending on context. It is praised as social skill, emotional awareness, and flexibility. But beneath this adaptability, something quiet begins to shift. The original sense of self, the one that exists without performance, begins to receive less and less attention. As time passes, the external roles become more dominant than internal awareness. A person starts to define themselves by what they do, what they provide, what they achieve, and how they are perceived in each environment. The question, "Who am I when nothing is expected from me?" becomes less frequently asked, and eventually it stops being asked at all. Instead, identity becomes built around function. The self is no longer experienced directly but inferred through roles. And when identity is constructed externally rather than internally, it becomes fragile, dependent on context, and constantly shifting. In this state, a person can become highly capable in many areas of life while simultaneously losing clarity about their inner landscape. They know how to respond, how to perform, how to fulfill expectations, but they gradually lose awareness of what feels naturally aligned within them. Preferences become secondary to responsibilities. Desires become secondary to obligations. Even emotions begin to be categorized based on whether they are appropriate for the role being played in a given moment. The inner voice becomes quieter, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer given space to influence direction. Forgetting oneself also creates a subtle emotional disconnection from time. Days become structured around external demands rather than internal rhythm. The natural fluctuations of energy, curiosity, and interest are replaced by schedules, duties, and expectations. A person may move through life efficiently, completing tasks and fulfilling obligations, but without moments of inner recognition. There is movement, but not necessarily presence. There is activity, but not necessarily awareness of the self experiencing that activity. Over time, this creates a sense of internal unfamiliarity. A person may pause and realize that they are more familiar with what others expect from them than with what they genuinely feel. They may struggle to answer simple internal questions about preference, direction, or emotional state because attention has been directed outward for so long that inward perception has become less precise. This does not happen suddenly. It is the result of repeated neglect of inner observation in favor of external functioning. In relationships, forgetting oneself often leads to over-identification with the needs and expectations of others. A person may become highly attentive to what others require while gradually losing awareness of their own boundaries. Emotional space becomes organized around external demands, and internal needs are adjusted, postponed, or minimized. This creates a pattern where the self is continuously shaped in response to others rather than expressed from within. Over time, this can lead to a sense of emotional invisibility to oneself. where personal needs are recognized intellectually but not felt with clarity or urgency. There is also a quiet fragmentation that develops when the self is consistently split across roles. Each role requires a slightly different version of behavior, tone, and emotional expression. While this is necessary for social functioning, without internal integration, it leads to a lack of coherence. The person begins to experience themselves as a collection of responses rather than a unified presence. In moments of solitude, this fragmentation can become more visible as there is no external structure to hold together the multiple versions of self that operate throughout the day. Eventually, forgetting oneself becomes normalized. The absence of inner reference is no longer perceived as loss because external functioning continues without interruption. Life appears organized, productive, and socially connected, yet internally there is a gradual fading of direct self-experience, where the sense of being is replaced by the experience of performing, responding, and adapting without sustained awareness of the one who is living it. At the center of all these habits, there is a single silent pattern: disconnection from inner life while remaining fully active in outer life. Emotional numbness, constant distraction, living for approval, avoiding inner pain, delaying life, and forgetting oneself are not separate problems. They are different expressions of the same drift away from presence. A life can appear stable, organized, even successful on the surface, while something essential quietly loses strength underneath. What makes this process difficult to notice is that it does not break a person suddenly. It reshapes them gradually. There is no single moment where everything changes. Instead, there are repeated small choices that feel harmless in isolation but become powerful in accumulation. Each habit removes a small piece of awareness, a small piece of honesty, a small piece of direct experience with life. Over time, what remains is functionality without depth, movement without presence, survival without full participation in living. Yet nothing about this state is permanent by nature. What has been learned can be unlearned, and what has been forgotten can be remembered again. The return does not require dramatic transformation. It begins with small moments where attention is no longer completely outsourced, where emotion is allowed to be felt instead of managed, where silence is not immediately filled, where inner truth is acknowledged without immediate adjustment for acceptance. Reconnection is not about becoming someone else. It is about removing what was added in order to survive. Beneath the layers of adaptation, avoidance, and performance, there is still a place where experience is direct, where feeling is real, and where life is not filtered through constant interpretation. That place does not disappear even when it is ignored for a long time. It only becomes quieter, waiting for attention to return to it again